Welcome to the very first episode of the ECAG Navigator Journal podcast, a new platform where we explore the big questions in export controls, trade policy, and Australia's role in a rapidly changing world. I'm your host, Jack Newbould. For this inaugural episode, I interviewed Dr. Nathan Gray from the University of Adelaide. Dr. Gray is a leading expert with more than 20 years' experience advising governments, industry, and international organisations on trade security and economic diplomacy. In his recent article for the journal, Australia's Strategic Trade Dilemma, Economic Ties with China versus Defence Alignment with the US, he gave a clear and thought-provoking assessment of one of the most pressing challenges facing Australia today. In this episode, we continue that conversation, exploring how Australia balances economic opportunity with national security in an era of strategic competition. This is the ECAG Navigator Journal podcast. Let's begin. Dr. Gray, thank you so much for your time today. I was wondering if you could start us off by letting us know, was there a particular motivation for you to write this piece or a specific event or trend that prompted it?
Probably the key thing is that the significant changes that we've been seeing in international trade policy over the last 9-10 months have impacted every part of industry in Australia. And the trade policy changes that the Trump administration is pursuing is mostly around economic security, national security, and increasingly defence manufacturing. And so the areas that I specialise in, which are to do with trade policy and how that affects value chains and exports and imports and investment, are also important for defence manufacturing. And obviously AUKUS is a key part of that. And what I'm seeing in the language that's being used in these executive orders very much links the two together. So trade policy is referencing defence and national security elements, and national security and defence policy in the US is referencing international trade, and particularly from an America first, or as many people are referring to it, an America-only policy perspective. So that's really where I come from, to provide some of that context behind what's going on in that space.
How do you define strategic trade in the context of Australia's relationships with both China and the US?
So strategic trade is really a coverall for all of our trade, whether it be agriculture, whether it be minerals export, and whether it be industrial goods. And the reason I say that is that all of those things that Australia exports and are involved in trade is important for what we do and is critical to our economic growth and our economic development. We can think about it in terms of a couple of core areas. So one of the areas is industrial policy, the renewal or the return of industrial policy in the Australian context. So we might think about the Future Made in Australia and the strategies associated with that. We're thinking about our defence manufacturing policies and things such as AUKUS, which is part of that as well, and being part of global value chains and technology sharing. That's part of that strategic trade. We can look at things such as the Australian government's critical minerals reserve, strategic reserve that we're looking at, developing something that is able to hold and build critical minerals in a way that allows us access to value adding some of these critical minerals and also influencing supply into those global value chains or regional value chains, which are in our strategic interests. So all of these areas cross the bounds of not just traditional trade where we sell to the highest bidder, but very much that strategic trade where we are most importantly selling to those countries and those companies that are most aligned with our approach to doing business. When we think about how that impacts on us in the context of the US and China, well, we're being squeezed in two different ways. So one of the ways is the US is influencing this strategic trade basis quite significantly with a range of measures. So one of the areas they've done is they've undertaken what they refer to as their reciprocal tariffs. These aren't really reciprocal. They are based on the perception of being ripped off in the US and balancing their total trade deficit, particularly in the goods sector rather than services. And what they've done is applied large across-the-board tariffs on countries. In Australia's instance, it's 10% for all our exports to the US. Separately to that, we have a range of sectoral tariffs that have been applied, and these are nearly all based on national security grounds in the US. Examples of these tariffs are a 50% tariff on steel, aluminium, and copper products, which is not just the commodities themselves, but products that have those ingredients in them. So if you think about a piece of machinery, it might have it might be made up of 50% steel, it might have 10% aluminium in it, might have some plastics and some electronics. Each of those might have a different tariff rate, and you have to add all those together as part of exporting to the US. Those trade controls are significant barriers to that cooperation between companies and countries, and that is impacting on the ability for strategic trade to work in the same basis as it has for the best part of 80 years. The US is also pursuing policies to reshore manufacturing. So there are restrictions on trade through these sectoral tariffs, through these reciprocal tariffs, in addition to enhanced investment rules around who can invest and where they can invest in the US, is changing that idea of what trade is about. The changing approach to defence export sales in the US, so defence products, defence procurement, where those products should be made is part of that argument as well. And then on top of that, there is an increasing number of defence, or not just defence, but export controls being developed in the US, everything down to what type of semiconductors, microchips that can be exported to countries like China. So this is all part of their strategic trade landscape and what they're doing, and it impacts on companies in Australia as they look to engage in that market, whether they're in the defence industry or they're in the non-defence industry. It impacts on both sides. And then we can look at the way China has behaved. So China has been reacting to US decision-making, which also puts a squeeze on Australia. So we can look at Chinese responses to the tariff rates has increasingly been to apply export controls on critical mineral exports to the US and around the world. So for starters, they stopped exporting certain products. They also have implemented a range of export controls to make listing of your all of the companies in your value chain, both downstream and upstream. So who are you going to provide these minerals to and for what purpose? And who are you buying these from and for what purpose? And the reason why they have done that is to prevent and try to restrict the flow of these pretty high-tech and critical rare earth minerals into the US defence value chain. And it's impacting that very, very much. And so what we see is we see situations which link to Australia as well with, one of the minerals that was restricted was a product called terbium. And terbium, up until recently, has only ever been produced in China. They developed a way of being able to create this mineral through separation and refining of some other metals, some other rare earths, in order to create the finished product, which then goes into high technology products. Recently, Australian company Lynas Group have been able to work on, they've been able to develop terbium in their facility in Malaysia. That's the first time outside of China that particular mineral has been created. These restrictions the Chinese have applied nearly all come from, or nearly all related to minerals that Australia produces. So we produce these minerals in raw form, and we export that to China, where it is often refined. And those refined products are those things that are being controlled into the supply that really feed into our global supply chains around high technology. So they feed into two core sectors that we care about: high technology and renewables. So all of the new facing industries that we're interested in Australia and around the world in the non-defence space, and then the defence industry, which require high technology, efficient ways of doing things, and they needed to be done really well. So we have two areas where they influence mostly, and they are critical to the way the Western world particularly, but every country in the world operates. And that's why, strategic trade is such an important area, and the current environment is highly uncertain.
What are the key trade-offs Australia faces in balancing economic dependency on China with security alignment via the US?
So Australia's trade relationship has changed quite significantly over the last 20 years particularly. If we go back to the early 2000s and most of the way through the first decade of the 2000s leading up to the global financial crisis, which we might call it in Australia, or the North Atlantic financial crisis, or the Great Recession as many Americans will refer to it. Up until that point, Australia's trade relationship with the US was its strongest. And we exported, the US was our largest or second largest export partner for most of our commodities, most of our products. We're talking about nearly every area, whether it was manufactured or non-manufactured items, we were exporting significant volume. As we go through the early 2000s, and particularly after the Chinese accede to the World Trade Organization and become part of that global trading system, the rules-based order, as you might add, we see increasing ties between China and Australia based on China's development story. It's based on a couple of core commodities which are important for Chinese growth. First area is iron ore, which continues to be strong today. Australian iron ore has driven growth in urbanisation in China. It's driven growth in the manufacturing sectors in China, and particularly in their manufacturing outputs. We have continued to provide significant volumes of iron ore to be able to achieve that. Additionally, products such as coal, which also goes into steel production, have been pretty critical to the growth story with China. To the point now where Australia's exports of everything makes up around about 30% of Australia's merchandise exports go to China. So 30% of Australia's merchandise exports go to China, whereas the US makes up around 4% of our exports. It's a significant difference. We are very heavily aligned with China, and also China is fairly dependent upon Australia for a lot of the things that we provide to it. Most of what we provide to China are minerals. So the highest value items are things such as iron ore, it's coal, copper, and then many of those rare earths that we talked about before, such as lithium in the past, nickel, some cobalt, and various other mineral items. The trade-off that Australia has is that although our economic relationship with China has rapidly acceded to a new height over the last 20 years particularly, our security relationship with the US has not diminished, and to a large degree it has increased. And so we are very reliant on our partnerships with the US, and I say that intentionally. Australia, remember, has a number of shared intelligence bases in Australia with the US, And we have shared platforms that we work on, manufacturing and otherwise, and we have significant access and inclusion and involvement in defence production value chains in Australia and the US. And that has been successful for our business and our defence industry in Australia and in the US. And so for Australia, as we move through this new paradigm where there is a lot more global conflict, at the moment it's not necessarily a hot conflict in our region, but it certainly is a hot conflict in Europe, if we think about the Ukraine and Russia war. And if we think about that hot conflict that's going on in the Middle East, in Gaza, we have quite a high-tension environment where policy making is rapidly changing. There are increasing numbers of countries that are choosing sides, particularly associated with the Russia and Ukraine war. And we have the risk that we're going to be asked to change the way we trade with other countries. We can see this already with the last week or so. President Trump made comments around countries buying and using Russian oil related to secondary tariffs, which are sanctions placed on other countries' trade with the US because they're buying Russian oil, and the idea that other countries need to stop purchasing products from Russia if they want the US to participate more in cracking down on Russian activities. If we think about the extension of that, there's no real expectation that, we might see that in Australia, but maybe we could. Maybe we could see a circumstance where there is increased tension between the US and China China asks, or the US asks Australia to curtail our exports of iron ore to the to China in order to prevent them having access to as much steel. Is there a chance that the US may ask Australia to stop selling rare earths, critical minerals to China in order to stop them having access to the raw supply of those minerals? If any of those circumstances were to occur, it would have significant impact on Australia's economic development, our economic growth, and likely the economy in a large way because of how dependent we are on the Chinese economy. So this question of our dependence, our economic dependence on China and our security dependence on the US is really hard. And it is a balancing act that is very challenging to overcome. And that's why you see our politicians of both persuasions, both major parties in Australia, trying to create or provide a nuanced analysis of where we're at, while still maintaining political point scoring, of course, but there's definitely a nuance in how they describe the challenge that each country is facing, and the Australian country particularly is facing in making decisions on these issues.
How deeply integrated is Australia in China's supply chains today, and which sections are most exposed?
So certainly Australia provides a lot of manufacture or merchandise goods to China, principally in minerals and quite a bit in food. So we export quite a lot of iron ore, coal, copper, rare earth minerals and other metals, and they are used in everything in the US, in China, from a property development perspective, infrastructure development, through to manufactured goods. And so from a minerals perspective, we're highly leveraged into that market. We need China and China needs us. Why does China need us? Well, we can produce those mineral products at a lower per unit cost than most other countries, which may sound strange, but even though Australia is a high-cost producer of most things, our wages are much higher than many other countries, we are very efficient in mining. So we are an efficient producer, we have good infrastructure, and we have low other costs of doing business, which mean that we are quite a valuable partner to be able to do business with and are critical for China. In the food sector, we also are increasingly an important partner. There's not many countries that can export excess wheat, barley, canola seed, and even some pulses. Australia have the ability to be able to do that, alongside other countries like Canada and the United States, and countries like Russia and Ukraine. But there are not that many countries that have a lot of excess grains, and Australia can do that. Similarly, our export of other food products like horticultural products, fresh fruit, as well as things like red meat, are also really important to that Chinese market. And they need that for the same reason. Many other countries don't have excess supply. Australia is a very large landmass and has comparatively few people. We have the ability to produce a lot of food. So the two main areas I would say were mineral exports and agricultural exports. And we need China to buy those products as much as they need them from us, because we provide them where others do not.
What does Australia gain from aligning more closely with US defence and security posture?
Australia gains a lot from our defence and security posture of the US. One is that Australia has been a defence partner with the US for nearly a century now. And we've worked with the US and fought alongside the US in wars since the First World War in the 1910s. Since the Second World War, Australia and the US have worked side by side on a range of defence and defence-related issues, development issues in Asia. And that's been really, really important. It's helped drive not just defence manufacturing in Australia, but it's driven a whole range of defence activities, shared inclusion in other wars, in order to uphold what Australia sees as the right thing to do. It's something that we've done for a long time, and we partner with the US on those. Our ongoing defence and security relationship gives us access to technology, gives us access and cooperation on defence matters, helps our armed forces with shared platforms, which gives us new ways of doing things and an ability to learn from the experiences of US forces where they've used similar platforms in the past. And of course, it provides access to a large degree to our defence manufacturing base to participate in US value chains, not just for the Australian products that we're buying, but also for other industries elsewhere. And that access to those value chains doesn't just impact on those single products. It gives us expertise that we can then use to put those products or those bits and pieces in the defence value chain into other platforms that maybe the US isn't directly involved with. Using and building our expertise in a way that can add value to the Australian defence sector and also to the Australian Defence Force. So it's a really important relationship that we have with the US.
Do you see any scenarios in which Australia might be forced to choose between economic interests with China and security commitments with the US, and what might trigger such a scenario?
It's a good question. If I start with the trigger and use an example, it would be if there was a hot war scenario. So a hot war scenario with some level of conflict that breaks out between the US and China, perhaps in regards to Taiwan, that would likely result in a request that Australia stops exporting things to China. Does that seem unrealistic? Not really. And we only have to go back to the 1930s to see that Australia's largest iron ore export destination was Japan. So in that period, in the build-up towards the Japanese expansion, the Japanese imperialist expansion into Manchuria and China, and then further into Southeast Asia, and of course the attack on Pearl Harbor, Australian iron ore had gone into a lot of Japan's industrial development, helped provide the steel through the iron ore that went into shipmaking and all the industrial development in Japan over that period. And of course, when the war was about to break out, sanctions stopped that export. So I don't think it's unrealistic to expect something similar could happen again. And the most likely flashpoint would be mainland China seeking to assert control of Taiwan through an invasion or something similar that might lead to either a hot or semi-hot conflict that involves the US. In that circumstance, I think we could reasonably expect the US to ask Australia to stop trading with China. And that'll be a very difficult decision to make.
Over the next 5 to 10 years, what shifts, either global, regional, or domestic, do you expect will impact Australia's trade defence balance the most?
Probably the largest impact is going to be what happens in the US. And what I mean is, at the moment, we have a very, very fast-moving policy circumstance in the United States, whether that's in defence manufacturing, whether it's in the trade posture, whether it's industrial policy or anything else. The defence is moving. The US administration is moving rapidly at the moment, and there's many more changes that are likely to occur in the future. A couple of things that are unlikely to change, I think. The movement towards a higher protectionist economy with high tariff barriers is probably unlikely to be unwound. So there are going to be restrictions on trade with the US for the foreseeable future. If we look back to any time there have been tariff increases in the US over the last 50 years, none of them have been unwound by an administration of the opposite party. So once they get there, they tend to be quite sticky. So that'll stay the same. But we're likely to see significant changes in policy around a whole range of areas, and that could include defence-related policy changes. And separate to that, and the bit we don't know, what are the flow-on effects that are going to impact on our other trading partners that are important to Australia? Countries like Vietnam, Indonesia, Japan, Korea. How are those? How is this trade war? How is this the new actions of the Trump administration going to affect the economies of those countries in 12 months' time, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years? All of those impacts are going to change the way Australia relates to the US through a necessity of where we do business. Are we doing business with these countries still? Are our exports significantly reduced demand? Does that impact on our own economic development? Ultimately, we're going to see a range of changes, and at the moment there are many unknowns. I think it's unlikely that we're going to know the answer on that for probably into next year to see how the global economy works.
What are the main risks for Australia from over-reliance on trade with China, either economically, politically, or socially?
There are a lot of risks that come with trade with China, primarily because of our dependence on them as a partner. Because of our 30% trade with China, they are really important, not just for individual companies, not just for our economy as a whole, but also for government tax receipts and revenues associated with profits developed and royalties developed from exports to China. You think about that economic risk. We can see that already with the economic coercive behaviour that China undertook towards Australia in 2020. We saw restrictions on Australian exports of wine and barley through anti-dumping findings, which have been unwound since, but were significant impacts on those industries and on communities involved in those industries. We saw unofficial trade sanctions on lobsters, timber, red meat, and coal, and gold. All of these things were impacting on particular parts of the economy because of our reliance on the Chinese market. So if we see the Chinese government wanting to undertake economic coercion, Australia can be is at risk of having a downturn in our economy, and that is a huge challenge. Socially, Australia is very well connected with China. We have a good Chinese diaspora in Australia. They are very good Australian citizens and very good Australian participants. The risk for us with any conflict, I suppose, in our trade relationship with China is that harmony is broken. And we saw that when the rhetoric was increased significantly against China in the last 5 years or so, which led to things such as the anti-dumping findings about barley and wine, and to a large degree, which were related with the COVID pandemic, which had nothing to do with Australia, with Chinese people in Australia, but many Chinese people found that very challenging. So that's quite a risk that, you know, there could be some social cohesion issues that arise from any conflicts that happen elsewhere. And then finally, the political risks. I think that there are significant. Managing that relationship between the US and China for Australia is going to be difficult. There's a lot of hard choices. And in a perfect world, our political class would like to be able to make statements that only the Chinese can hear and make statements that only the US can hear. But unfortunately, they can't. They're going to make statements that both sides can hear, and there are ramifications for whatever they say. And so it's very easy for a government to be able to get ourselves into trouble by saying something that sits on the fence, that balances both sides of the relationship and ends up offending both sides to the detriment of Australia. And that's going to be the very big challenge into the future, particularly as we have increasing tensions, increased temperature, and much more demands for Australia to change our behaviour to either the US or to China on either trade or security.
What are the risks or potential downsides for sovereignty, regional perception, or costs of leaning heavily into the US alliance?
So the main costs or risks for Australia with the increasing the reliance on the security relationship with the US is certainly economic in nature. There are certain industries where it is going to be very difficult for Australia to be able to find another partner as strong as China to be able to continue to buy our products. China makes up, I think, around 75% of global demand for iron ore, which is very hard to be able to replace. We're not going to find another partner who wants to buy $120 billion worth of iron ore. That just doesn't exist. We might supply a bit more to Japan or a bit more to Korea, but we're not going to supply significantly high amounts that will offset that market. Similarly, for products like coal, we have a similar dependence on a market like China to buy our particular coal that we export there. If we look at lower value items like wine, we're also really limited with how many markets can absorb as much wine as the Chinese were prepared to absorb from Australia. And so there are significant costs with our security relationship if they were to be demands that we were to change our behaviour. In terms of the risks, if we were to say to an American administration that asked us to reduce our trade with China, the challenge for Australia is significant. If we decided to ignore that request, then we really remove our ability to operate with many of our defence infrastructure. Many of our defence platforms are US-based systems. We have shared military bases across Australia. We have shared assets, of intelligence sharing, without the US involvement here, but potentially with still those shared bases. Australia loses some of, I suppose, the protection or implied protection while maintaining a target as a place where there is still going to be a significant US presence. I think it's unlikely, for example, that the US won't continue to have a presence at Pine Gap. It's unlikely that they'll withdraw from Darwin. Those particular areas make Australia a target without the implied security apparatus. I think we're at significant risk. And so Australia's probably in the incidents where we're damned if we do and we're damned if we don't, and all of our options are bad. So at the moment, there will be Australian government policymakers and politicians that are working through how do we deal with these issues, scenario planning on this. And everyone will be hoping that we don't have to make these choices.
How does Australia's relationship with regional neighbours factor into this trade versus defence dilemma?
So our relationship with the US is really important, but our relationship with Asia is even more important. You know, I said earlier that 20 years ago, the US was our largest or second largest trading partner. But increasingly over the last 20 years, we've seen other parties, other countries, in addition to the US, fall down the list of most important to Australia from a trade perspective. Our largest trading partners are now countries like China, Japan, Korea, India, Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia, Vietnam, the Philippines. Our partnerships in Southeast Asia, East Asia, Northeast Asia, and South Asia continue to increase, and they will do because they are part of our region. We are always going to look to trade and do business and operate with our friends and allies in North America, in Europe, but we have to remember that we live in the region where we are, and Asia is proximity close to us in Australia, and there's going to be a continued need to be able to manage those relationships. And so how those countries are impacted by trade with the US and trade with China and with military aggression from either country will necessarily impact on Australia. And we will need to maintain those relationships, whether they're at the political level and dialogues such as the ASEAN summits, for example, or the East Asian Forum, or whether it's our trade agreements such as the ANZFTA, the ASEAN, Australia, New Zealand Free Trade Area, whether it's the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which includes ASEAN plus Japan, Korea, China, and New Zealand, or whether it's trade architecture like the CPTPP, the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, which includes a lot of countries from East Asia, Southeast Asia, through to Latin America and North America. Those architectures and those forums for discussion are really important and will continue to be as Australia balances our economic and security relationships as a middle power. We don't have the ability to make decisions on our own, unilateral decisions, without having buy-in from our neighbours, our friends, and our trade partners. And so I think that's a really important distinction to make there, that our partners in Asia are our partners, and making decisions without them is not really feasible.
Thanks for joining me on the inaugural episode of the ECAG Navigator Journal podcast. A special thanks to my guest, Dr. Nathan Gray, for his insights and his article, Australia's Strategic Trade Dilemma, Economic Ties with China versus Defence Alignment with the US. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with your network and explore more insights at ecag.com.au. I'm Jack Newbould, and I look forward to bringing you more conversations in the episodes ahead.